In this session, we'll have some commentary from independent analysts, academics and others on the report, and I'll make an opportunity at the end of the panel for Patricia and perhaps Gary to make some final comments from the Commission on the commentary that comes through this discussion. But of course they and all are free to join in the conversation as we proceed through this panel. The first presentation is actually a video coming in from Ross Garnaut, who was scheduled to be a participant in this forum from the beginning, and because of the change in schedule, of which many of you will be aware, he wasn't able to be here today. He's in fact, of course, in Papua New Guinea. And he's prepared this just on exit from Papua New Guinea late last week for presentation, and we'll run the video now.
I'm very glad to be able to join you in this way, although sorry that the change of dates for the conference meant that I could not be with you in person. I think that the issue that's covered in the draft report of the Productivity Commission, and which is the subject of today's conference, is of very large importance for Australia and the international community. We're discussing these issues at a critical time within Australia. This is the time when we're just starting to face up to the implications of a deterioration in political culture which has generated what I've described as the great Australian complacency of the early 21st century. One consequence of the great complacency is that after being right at the top of the OECD League for productivity growth in the 1990s, Australia's gone right down to the bottom in the first decade of the 21st century, and in the last 5 years has had no total factor productivity growth at all. And in the international community, and especially in the Western Pacific region that means the most to us, a decade of rapid trade liberalisation and trade expansion from the mid-80s until the Asian financial crisis has given way to a period of problematic trade and the replacement of strong momentum for unilateral liberalisation and multilateral liberalisation by the growth of preferential trading areas, which has seriously disrupted that wholesome pattern of regional and global trade expansion. This is not the first time the world has faced big issues of these kinds. We faced them early in the 20th century, we faced them in the 1930s. But let's be clear, we're facing historic choices at the moment, and the discussion of the draft report of the Productivity Commission will be part of Australia's choice. I think it's worthwhile going back into the history, and I like to go back to the big debate about preferential trade at the beginning of the 20th century, where a British Conservative Party, of which Winston Churchill was a member, was contemplating movement from open free trade to preferential trade. And a young and clear-headed and forceful young man called Winston Churchill warned the leader of his party, and I'll go back to Jenkins' biography of Churchill. Churchill said, "Our planet is not a very big one compared with other celestial bodies, and I see no particular reason why we should endeavour to make inside our planet a smaller planet called the British Empire, cut off by impassable space from everything else." And then Churchill wrote to his leader, Balfour, "I am utterly opposed to anything which will alter the free trade character of this country, and I consider such an issue superior in importance to any other now before us. Preferential tariffs, even in respect of articles which we are bound to tax for revenue purposes, are dangerous and objectionable. But of course it is quite impossible to stop there. And I am persuaded that once the policy is begun, it must lead to the establishment of a complete protective system involving commercial disaster and the Americanisation of English politics. On that issue, Churchill left the Conservative Party and moved to the Liberals. It was a big issue, big enough for him to make that large choice. Well, for Australia, the tradition established by the Tariff Board and then the Industries Assistance Commission, the Industries Commission and the Productivity Commission was to have a draft report on important issues before coming to a final report, and that great tradition of the draft report gives us an opportunity to turn this current exercise into a contribution to important Australian choices at a time when choices need to be made. As I see it, the draft report before us contains a lot of good thoughts and good ideas, a lot of bad thoughts and bad ideas, and they're jumbled together without much analytic clarity. And the task of the final report is going to be to re-inject the analytic rigour that has allowed the Tariff Board and its successors to play an important role in public policy in Australia over the past 40 years. Let's look at some of the domestic policy systemic effects and some of the international policy systemic effects that have been associated with the breakdown of commitment to free, open trade in the 21st century. At home, the movement to preferential trade was associated with a breakdown in commitment to the open, transparent processes that had supported unilateral trade liberalisation in Australia in the period of reform. The old system, and it had been crucial to the changes in Australian policy, had involved independent public assessments by the Tariff Board, then in the Industries Assistance Commission, Industries Commission, Productivity Commission, of the effects of trade liberalisation. That was all made independently, subject to public discussion, and while governments need not take the advice of the Productivity Commission, the whole world knew the advice and the reasons for it. Well, a different approach was adopted with free trade agreements. A different approach had to be adopted because we know what independent analysis would have said about each of these bilateral agreements if it had been the Productivity Commission and not a commercial party whose conclusions were subject to influence had been the source of so-called feasibility studies. I think the draft report lets the work that was done, the so-called feasibility studies on the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement, off altogether too lightly. Let's go back to the history. There were two reports done by the Centre for International Economics. The first one, from memory, was premised on removal of all barriers to goods and services trade in both countries, and generated an increase in GDP of around 0.4%. Once the agreement had been negotiated, the main sources of benefits, which were agricultural liberalisation and especially in sugar, beef, and to a lesser extent dairy, were entirely or partially excluded. Now, the government had committed itself to having another study done on the actual effects of the agreement, and the study was to go before a Senate committee that was to look at the treaty. Well, the work was done, but the assumptions were changed, and suddenly, although most of the sources of the benefits of the original study had been removed by negotiations, the benefits turned out to be substantially larger. I know the discussion in Foreign Affairs when that became available. There was some questioning of the conclusions, but then the relevant Deputy Secretary said, but it's a good bottom line, and that was made public, and the rest of Australia was advised that the actual agreement was going to generate larger benefits than the original analysis had shown would be associated with complete free trade, complete removal of barriers on a bilateral basis. That was the beginning of what can straightforwardly be described as the corruption of the policy analysis and policy making process in Australia, and variations on that theme have been part of all of the discussions of free trade agreements since then. It's very important for the sake of the integrity of our policy making processes and for the outcomes that we get back to independent analysis, transparent analysis, that can be used as a basis of public education. And I think the conclusion of the final report of the Productivity Commission gives us a chance to do that. And then internationally, the processes were different, but the shift into preferential trade in the rest of the world as well as in Australia marked the end of the era of unilateral trade liberalisation, and also the end of the era of multilateral liberalisation. Now, the multilateral system may have run into trouble anyway, but there's no doubt that the dynamics of pervasive bilateral negotiations weakened support for real multilateral liberalisation. Much more important, it removed the basis, the political basis for continued momentum in unilateral liberalisation. The idea of strong gains being associated with unilateral liberalisation didn't die. It remained important in academic and some high policy discussion, but it ceased to be the driving force behind trade policy through our critically important Western Pacific region. Well, where do we go from here? I think we have to restore the Australian political culture of the era of reform and a strong, analytic, rigorously argued final report from the Productivity Commission can play an important role in that, just as the clear, analytically strong reports of the Tariff Board were so important to the Australian trade policy discussion a few decades ago. Internationally, one has to recognise that it's going to be a long haul. Australia's influence for the good on transparent analysis and unilateral liberalisation, of course, has been greatly weakened by our own example. But we could turn that to our advantage. It was noticed earlier on that Australia's far-reaching unilateral liberalisation had been associated with a big improvement in productivity performance. The 1990s put Australia at the top of the Productivity Growth League of the OECD. That was noticed and over time became part of a case for unilateral liberalisation in other countries. We can use the underperformance of Australia, the loss of momentum in productivity growth, to argue the contrary point, that the deterioration in our productivity culture, our political culture, the return to rent-seeking behaviour, the departure from independent, transparent analysis had the effects that economists and others would have predicted for it in ending the era of strong Australian productivity growth. So we can turn what's a very painful outcome for Australia into a virtue by showing the Australian case to be an example both of the positive benefits of a transparent process and unilateral liberalisation and the negative effects of its absence. We can, once we have restored the role of the Productivity Commission, and restored its analytic strength as well as its independent capacity, then it will be useful for us to argue the case for similar transparency institutions in other countries. At the height of Australia's superior productivity performance, and at the height of the role of the Productivity Commission in trade policy, the Australian example was much discussed in a number of countries in our region. I know from personal experience it was much discussed in Indonesia and in China. We can get back to that period of positive influence on institutional development once we are doing better ourselves. Finally, what do we do about the niggling problem, but more than a niggling problem, of discrimination against us as a result of other countries' preferential trading areas in the Asia-Pacific? Well, the first thing I would do is to keep in mind the strong message from the draft report that most of the benefits from trade liberalisation for Australia still come from our own liberalisation. So let's get back to getting rid of the rest of our protection. And alongside that, I would suggest that we make an offer to any country that wants to enter an FTA with us or preferential trading agreement with us, that we will offer to them in each area of trade the most favourable terms that we have offered anyone else. Now, they're pretty favourable because we have very open access for New Zealand. And what we would require in return is simply for them to offer us as much as they have offered anyone else. China offering us commodity by commodity, the most favoured nation treatment given to either New Zealand or ASEAN would remove the discrimination, which is a significant problem for us. And we could go forward remembering that what matters most is what we do ourselves, that we can have a positive influence on other countries' trade liberalisation through being an example of the benefits of open process and trade liberalisation, and in not seeking to use bilateral agreements to do any more than to remove discrimination that has already been introduced by the discriminatory areas of the early 21st century.
Well, that's a message from the lead coach, Patricia. We've got some backup here now, and to get the panel started, I've got Andrew McCredie, who's CEO of Australia Services Roundtable, to make his contribution.
Yep. I represent the Australian Services Roundtable, which is the big business body for the services sector in Australia. The services sector is about 80% of the economy, so it is quite significant. Now, Peter's told me I've got 10 minutes, so I'm going to rush through some of these slides. Ross Garnaut has reminded us all that one of the dangers of these preferential trade agreements is that it's taken, to some extent, diverted resources and taken our eye off the ball in some other spaces, including the multilateral and capacity building and the unilateral liberalisation space. Now, I think that's certainly true with respect to services in the Doha round. Part of the problem of services in Doha has been the idea that we had to fix up all the negotiations on agriculture first, and then we had to move on to fixing up all the negotiations on manufacturing second. And then finally we would get round to having a look at services. And as we never fixed up agriculture, we didn't make much progress on manufacturing, and we didn't even look really at services. So that has been a problem. Last year, after the Global Services Summit, when I and my colleagues from business groups managed to get a number of trade ministers together in Washington, we managed to get agreement that this sequencing thing would end in the WTO, and I think that's going to be good. And it's going to put more attention on actually what we can do in Doha on services. So certainly I think we have not put the intellectual effort into figuring out how we can make progress in services. And so to the extent that we have diverted energy into FTAs away from doing this task, I think that's been a bad thing. Now, I'm representing all of industry here because I was asked to, but I do have a services focus. Now, I put up here the 10 top exports for Australia, and you'll notice 6 of them are goods and 4 of them are services. But if we look at the goods, things like coal and iron ore and gold and crude oil and natural gas and aluminium, actually I don't think there's much in the way of trade barriers in relation to those things. So the trade barriers that remain in the world are very heavily focused on services, professional services in particular. Now, not all of them are outward barriers. In education services, as I think everybody knows, we've kicked the most fantastic own goal, which will probably result in education services dropping about 20% this coming year. So, you know, again, I think what Ross is saying to us, there are other things in the world other than FTAs which have a huge impact on trade, on services trade in particular, which is not to say that FTAs aren't important. Now, it's also, that previous graph just looked at the conventional over-the-border trade. But in fact, in the case of services, virtually 2/3 of services are traded by what's known as Node 3. And that's the activities, commercial activities of foreign affiliates. So that's really investment, foreign investment. And so the rules and regulations associated with foreign investment are the most important thing for services trade. And in fact, 60% of world foreign investment is in the services sector. You can see that world FDI, that's world investment, has massively outpaced world growth in exports, and services exports actually outpaced goods exports over the last 15 years or so. So most of this FDI, as I said, is services related. So the services issues are the big sort of unleft issues that need to be resolved. So I think the organisers of this and asking me to talk did the right thing. And the services issues focus around a lot, obviously, to do with business establishment. How do you set up companies in other countries? How do you get your money back? What sort of tax you have to pay? What regulations you have to meet? And indeed, some of these issues are not even necessarily so much about what the rules are, but just even necessarily finding out what they are so that you can do them. So transparency of how you do these things is quite important. Then there's travel and work visas is enormously important, and I noticed that the Productivity Commission put in the report that there's 12,000 Australians visiting the US out of the US FTA. Now, if you think that the average business person is probably associated with something like $500,000 worth of business, then that's a $6 billion worth of business activity that Australians are now doing in the US, which they weren't doing before. So that is an enormously significant outcome, but as I think it rightly says in the report, it wasn't a direct outcome of the FTA because the Ways and Means Committee said that under no circumstances ever in any FTA would they allow changes to visa rules. So that was something that was negotiated afterwards. And that is a complicating factor, I guess, of any analysis of what FTAs are or how they do things and so forth. And this is, I think, quite common. One of my members was telling me on legal services, as a result of the study, the feasibility study done with India, they have now signed an MOU with the Bar Council, and they set in train a series of steps which will open up access to the Indian legal market for Australian lawyers. So that's been precipitated before the FTA has even started, but the very fact of the feasibility study, which talked about all the broad things that you might imagine it would talk about, and the importance of legal services to facilitating business links, that's enabled things to happen. So I think part of the story of FTAs is they're part of a mosaic of things that happen. They do enable some useful things to happen. They shouldn't be seen in isolation. They're part of the overall thing that DFAT does, and indeed I think Austrade increasingly ought to be doing. And a lot of these issues, the trade liberalisation issues that I've got up here, get hit upon in a number of different areas of the bureaucracy. Now, just to sort of give you a bit of an overview of what ASR thinks about all these things, pretty much, agree with what Ross Garnaut was saying about the Great Australian Complacency and how we need to tackle this productivity agenda, and fire it up again. And trade exposure certainly is a very important way of doing that, and trade liberalisation is important here. I'd also say that trade development shouldn't be forgotten, and so as part of the overall mosaic, the work of Austrade and how they can actually assist in helping SMEs get into export markets is an important thing too. As the report calls them, BRTAs, they can do some useful things. They have done some useful things, but certainly there is the risk that we think they're too important, and they can divert resources away from other important things that we need to be doing. And so we need, I guess, in providing our advice to government, we think there should be a balance across the unilateral, the multilateral, the trade development, and the FTA space. And most importantly, there are huge linkages between all of these areas. So, as I was describing with the Indian situation, a lot of that work has now been undertaken outside the FTA space. Some of it could be facilitated by Austrade. But it was initiated by work in the FTA space. So this is, I think, very common, and particularly common in services for these sorts of things to occur. So on the recommendations, I'm not going to comment on all of them. The ones I don't comment on, I broadly agree with. On the critical mass agreements, I think they are an important new initiative, and some of them are occurring in the services space. And so ASR strongly agrees that Australia should be participating in these critical mass agreements. It is clear that in the WTO, it is impossible to get the full range of countries to get across the issues to really make progress on some of these things. The PC's comments on negotiating coin, I think, are absolutely correct, and we strongly support those. ASR does support a transparency mechanism. We've signed up with the Tasman Transparency Group, calling for all governments to do this, and I think this would be a useful role for the PC to be engaged in on an international transparency initiative. We fully support the recommendation on flexibility and coverage. We think that if you can make progress on services, and it's impossible in some agreements like Japan to make progress on agriculture, well, why would we want to stop making progress on services? Japan is very, very closed on services, and yet it is clearly in their economic interest to move forward, and so it's not a difficult, in my view, it's not a difficult or impossible negotiation to make progress there, and so why should we hold that up for something which is not very likely and not as economically significant. Now, there's a lot of writing and discussion in the report about establishment processes and counting dollars associated with FTAs and so forth. I think, to me, that is putting too much emphasis on FTAs. It runs the risk of diverting more resources into FTAs when I think possibly we've got more than we need there. I would hate to have parliamentary committees spending more time writing more reports about it. I think they have a role in the scheme of things, but it's a relatively small role and it shouldn't be, I think the recommendations wouldn't help where we want to go. Now I just want to give a little case study to give you a bit of a picture of the unilateral, because I haven't talked about unilateral, but there's huge opportunities in unilateral. Australia's health exports were $5 million last year, and yet many people would say that our health professionals are almost as skilled as our academics. And we had $16 billion worth of education exports last year. So 5 million in health, 16 billion in education. In our region, we've got Thailand, India, Malaysia, who many people would think have slightly less qualified health professionals than us, all with health strategies. India's has got a sort of business operational revenue up to 4 billion in 2005. It's probably tripled since then. There's going to be 1.6 million Americans travelling. So this is a huge industry. Now, what's our market opening in health? It's one of the lowest in the WTO. We have a virtually closed. The zero is sort of fully closed, right? So 8 and 12.5 is very low. We don't have a billing system, so if a foreigner comes into our health system, we don't know how to bill them. So when our members say we've got 12,000 Americans from an insurance company that would like to come and do operations in Australia, well, we can't respond. Unlike education, where we would snap them up straight away and put them into some course, we can't respond and help. So, you know, there's a whole range of things that we need to do. And so this is what I guess Ross Garnaut is talking about. And also, you know, we would import health services, administration services, a whole range of services into our system. So trade liberalisation in health would make a massive difference to productivity. And so if you're looking at sort of what are the big picture things that we need to do, and I think this is a bit what Ross is talking about, well, you know, would any FTA that we've got on the horizon make anywhere near as much difference as doing this sort of thing in health? And I think the answer is no. And so that's why I wanted to put up this as a case study about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our panelist is Christopher Findlay. Christopher is Dean of the Economics Faculty at Adelaide University and an expert on commercial policy, economic policy in Asia Pacific.
Oh, thanks very much, Peter. And thanks for the opportunity to join you today. What I'd like to do is take some material that I think is mostly in the report, run through it quickly and use it to talk about how some of the commentary or recommendations might be made richer and clearer and firmer in the process. So let me first of all go through a series of trends that mostly, as I said, the report refers to. Use that to talk about what sort of policy regime you might like to have to operate in this environment and capture the opportunities that are there. And then, as I said, come back to the report and some of its recommendations. Now, I think most of these are in the report. Let me mention half a dozen or so, and I'll be quick. And that also means I'll be unqualified. So some of these stories are more complicated than I'll pretend, but I just want to make a point quickly. The report demonstrates how the environment in which we operate has changed, how the country's economy structure of the world has shifted, how some economies have got bigger, and how our trading patterns have changed. All of those things are really important for our growth and performance. They offer us prospects of new trading partners, new sources of inputs. But that also requires, in terms of the design of a regime, that also requires a system that lets us take advantage of those opportunities and lets us switch our sourcing of our inputs around. First point. Second point, the report has some quite striking charts in it about what's happened to average MFN tariffs. Really, really striking pictures about how the average tariff rates have gone down on manufactured products. These are the MFN rates, and that's a really important piece of information because it says that, yes, I know that there are some variations. Like I said, I'm going to skip past some of the qualifications, but it says that that part of the trading regime is moving towards the set of characteristics which we'd like to have in order to take advantage of the developments that I mentioned, and the first set of characteristics that I mentioned. And we certainly want to continue that. And yes, we want to deal with the outliers, but we certainly want to keep pushing the average MFN rates down. The third characteristic that I think is out there is the increasing sophistication in the design of supply chains. Now, I'm not sure how much of this is in the report, but a little bit. But there's some research done, including here at the ANU, about how the chains are getting more complex, how there's more steps in them, how the amount of value added at each step is getting smaller, how the number of movements is increasing. All of this makes sense, but what it requires is a pretty fancy trading system, and one that's able to shift things around quickly, kick costs out of the transport arrangements, avoid delay, and make sure all the complementary services that you need are there, like logistics and infrastructure. That's the third thing. The fourth thing, which the report also points to, is the growth in foreign direct investment flows and how they've grown much faster than output has grown. And that's all part of the structural change thing that I started with. That's industries relocating as their competitiveness shifts in order to find new locations for production. And it's about the implementation of those supply chains as well across all the areas. The scope for tremendous gain from those capital flows. Ross talked about the productivity issue, and we know that foreign direct investment is associated with contributions to productivity growth. We know that the arrival of foreign investors is also associated with the scope for competition in domestic markets. Both of those things we really want to try and capture in this regime that we want to design. But when we talk about competition, well, that's what we really want. We want a competitive regime which has entry options to all providers, not just foreign providers, but domestic providers as well. That's the fourth point about foreign direct investment. The fifth point is about unbundling. It's about the growth of the service sector. And that's in the report too, I think, and there's a discussion about the growth of trade in services, which is associated with that. As within domestic economies, the structure of the economy shifts, the service sector gets bigger, and those people look, as Andrew's explained, for opportunities for international transactions. That leads us to a focus on the barriers to trade and investment in services, because services, many of them are delivered through establishment. And as the report points out, there has been quite a good discussion about the nature of barriers to trade in services, how some are cost creating and some are rent creating, and I think Philippa's going to talk more about these later today. But we definitely want to capture, we want to have a focus on dealing with those policy questions, because just like the FDI flows, they're associated with the productivity drivers that Ross is worrying about. They're associated with competition, they're associated with the transfers of technology, and as I think Philippa might explain, the priorities there are the cost reducing, the cost increasing barriers to trade and investment. And finally, and I don't think there's too much in the report about this, but I think we're learning more about exporters and what they do. The ABS has just released a terrific new data set on firm level surveys, so Australia's finally catching up to Indonesia, which for years has been reporting very interesting data at the firm level on the characteristics of businesses and who exports. What are the characteristics of those firms? We're starting to understand that a bit better, and guess what some of the characteristics of exporters are? They're also importers. They're also importers. They're big, they're traders, they're globally orientated firms. They look to sell their product offshore, they look to procure their inputs from offshore. I was in a meeting in Sydney earlier in the week, and they were talking to us about a case study of a lady who makes chocolates and sells them to the Middle East. Yes, she sells them to the Middle East, but she looks worldwide for her wrappers. She'll look worldwide. She doesn't just sell the chocolates to the Middle East and buy the wrappers back. You get what I mean. The other thing about that data is it says that a surprisingly small share of businesses in a sector that you'd expect to be internationally competitive are actually exporters. Numbers are a bit soft at the moment, but if you just look at what the ABS has released, it says about 10%. And my recollection of other countries is that it's a similar sort of order of magnitude. That is, take a sector, it's internationally competitive according to the trade data, net exports, but only all those exports are accounted for by a very small proportion of firms. So what's going on there? Why is it that such a small proportion of people are actually exporting? Is it something to do with the services that are surrounding them, the infrastructure they're operating in, the information they have, their access to finance? There's some really big questions here about the policy environment that might be influencing that performance. Now, I could go on, and there's new things coming along, and we can talk about climate change and the other issues that are coming in the international trading system, but I've got enough. I think I've got enough. What regime would I like to have in order to capture these benefits, deal with these issues, drive productivity in this environment? I think I would want a regime that was multilateral. I would want a regime that was pro-competitive. I'd want a regime that dealt with what some people have called the across-the-border issues. Those, customs procedures, transport, ports, all those things, because that's part of the supply chain story. I'd want a regime that dealt with those cost-creating barriers in the service sector. And I'd want a regime that was comprehensive, because all of those things fit together. There's complementarity between the growth of manufactured goods trade from investment and service. I think they're the characteristics of the regime that I'd be looking for in this environment. Now, what's going to give that to me? What's going to give that to me? Can you guess what the answer to the next? Can you guess what the next question is? Can you guess what the answer is? Will a preferential trading arrangement give me that regime? No. No, it won't. It won't give me that regime. It won't give me that regime. It's focused on one trading partner. It's not focused on an environment that takes account of the possibility of all the structural change. We're building preferential trading agreements in an environment where average tariffs are falling. Presumably the consequence of that is very low utilisation rates of these agreements, and some of the data that I've seen does suggest that's the case. Are we dealing with the supply chain issues that in these preferential agreements? Some people argue we are, and my colleague Richard Pomfret argues that strongly, but I'd like to see more discussion of that in the report. Trade facilitation becomes a very important issue. It's not clear that all the agreements deal with that comprehensively, and anyway, that's the sort of thing you wouldn't deal with preferentially. That's a institutional infrastructure setting which would apply to all trading partners. You'd want a regime that dealt with the FDI flows, but in this environment where you're trying to create competition, as the report I think itself says, you don't want to have a regime where you're giving foreign providers preferential access into protected markets, because all you'll end up doing is sharing the rents with them. You'd want a regime that dealt with services in the same manner and helped deal with some of the issues that are behind export performance. So while I answer this in the negative, can I make some? Well, first of all, I think that point's worth making in the report. The foundations of that argument, I think, are there already. If you take the points that are there and extend it, I think that's an important observation to keep reminding people of. Is there a regime that would deliver those characteristics that I'm looking for? Well, yes, there is. Yes, there is. And what's it called? Thank you for that intervention, and the answer is it's not utopia. These characteristics, let me mention them again, and I'll take another minute for the chair as a result of that intervention. We want a multilateral regime. We want a regime that's comprehensive. It deals with investment, services and goods. We want something that's pro-competitive and deals with trade facilitation. What's that called?
Does it start with A?
It starts with A.
Ends in C?
Ends in C. Is that not? Are they not critical principles of the APEC agenda which we've been working on for years? My suggestion, therefore, is that the report that makes this as a stronger point. Yes, there is some reference to APEC. We saw some of the modelling results, but I think it's valuable to make that point in the report. This is a really important opportunity, especially in the context of everything else that's going on in the region about the institution building that's happening, for the Australians to be clear about what they think APEC is about and how it can contribute is a real contribution in this report has the opportunity to do that. I know that lots of folks in APEC are thinking about this, but here's an opportunity for some thoughtful people to really reinforce that agenda. And finally, Mr. Chairman, in my last minute, as Malcolm said earlier, it's true that we're not operating with a green field situation. We don't have a clean slate here. I think that doesn't mean that it's not worth making the APEC point that I've just talked about. But at the same time, I think this way of thinking about things lets you make some tougher commentary, clearer commentary on some of the existing FTAs and some of the issues that the report rightly brings up about them. Now, 5 seconds on each one. Do we think accession's a good idea? Yeah, absolutely. If you had an FTA, all we're doing now is saying, yes, there are a whole lot of FTAs on the table. Given this framework, what suggestions would we have about them and how they might evolve? Would we like to see good accession clauses in them, or those clauses rewritten? Absolutely, because that's at least some sort of contribution to getting towards a more multilateral regime. Do we want them comprehensive? Absolutely we want them comprehensive, because of the nature of this business environment. Do we want to have what is it called, a CMA, a sectoral agreement? I wouldn't go near a sectoral agreement if it was preferential. Let me think. Can I think of an example of a preferential single sector agreement? Oh, I know. Air transport. Air transport. And I think that's the world you'd end up in that circumstance. If you want a single sector agreement in the context of the world that I've tried to describe, I think it needs to be non-discriminatory. Trade facilitation, worth much more attention, I think, and non-discrimination, absolutely worth exploring, and Ross laid out some options. So, Mr. Chairman, they're my observations firstly on a way of thinking about what's happening, and then secondly, a lot of that's in the report already, and I think a lot of that can be used to elaborate and enrich the recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christopher. Some crisp comments now from Anne Capling from Melbourne.
I used to hate these damn PTAs, but I think I'm subject to the Stockholm syndrome now, so Peter, will you give me a 2-minute warning? I've just got 3 slides, I think. I'm going to come at this at a slightly different angle, and not just because I'm the token scientist on the panel, but because I want to address a different set of issues. First of all, the point has been made, but I think needs to be made more forcefully. Unlike rich countries, Australia in the OECD, and unlike countries like China, Australia's liberalisation has been unilateral. Yeah, we got credit for it in the Uruguay round, but it has been unilateral. And this makes us very similar to developing countries over the last 15 years. And that's because our focus has been on the domestic consequences of liberalisation. We've always had a lack of concern, in reality, with reciprocity, and that's because we don't have terms of trade concerns in the areas that are covered by trade agreements, or because we simply have no clout. So when you think about it, in theory, we should be completely indifferent to this question of forum choice, whether we negotiate preferentially or multilaterally. And that is the case with many developing countries. Of course, there's good reasons why we've made a very big effort multilaterally, and not all of them have to do with the trade liberalisation benefits, but that's not the story for today. I think the problem is, and I think this should come out more squarely in the report, there are a lot of things that PTAs can do that can't be attainable through the WTO and multilateral negotiations. And I think we just have to come to terms with this, whether we like it or not. And even though probably most people would agree that these do damage to the multilateral trade system. So you've got PTAs to deepen regional economic integration, and ZERTA. PTAs is a lab, the services annex for ANZERTA. PTAs with key trade partners for defensive reasons. I give you GCC and what's left of the Australian car industry. PTAs for geopolitical reasons. I give you China. PTAs for foreign policy reasons. AUSTA is a good start and not a finish there. And to promote regionalism, ANZERTA would be a really good example for that. I am simplifying things, but these are the realities that have driven each of these agreements. And what we go looking for after this then are the economic justifications for agreements that are often driven by, first and foremost, by non-economic considerations. So in this sense, PTAs and the WTO shouldn't be seen as substitutes for each other. They aren't. They do different things. I know it's outside of the brief of the PC's report, and I'm really glad that the PC finally got a chance to do this report. We've been waiting for it for 10 years, but of course they couldn't do a thing without the government giving them the terms of reference. So that was a really good thing. It's outside of the report, but let's not forget that the WTO gives us near universal rulemaking. Don't underestimate this. Not just for old issues like anti-dumping and trade remedies, TBTs, but also the new issues that are upon us already: food security, energy security. These are going to be huge issues in our region, and they're going to get really difficult, I think. We're seeing it already. The interface between the whatever emerges as our climate change regime and the trade regime. All the benefits that we get institutionally from the WTO, and economists know this: transparency, monitoring, surveillance, dispute settlement that isn't necessarily in PTAs, and the deliberation and the ongoing learning that comes from interaction constantly through the WTO. And of course, liberalization without the costs that come with rules of origin. So those, I think, I would like to see a sharper distinction in the report about the idea of what PTAs do that the WTO can't do, and perhaps a reminder of what the WTO does that PTAs can't do. But really, I think the really powerful recommendations are in Chapter 13 of the report, and I really commend the PC. I'd like to see in the final report a greater elaboration of some of these issues, some of the work that Australia and APEC more broadly has been doing in these soft law approaches about how to make PTAs that are, in a sense, friendly to the greater cause of non-discrimination and multilateralism. And I think that could be valuably elaborated in more detail. I can't but endorse all the comments that have been made about the abuses in the modelling that we have seen that has accompanied other PTAs, especially the Australia-US FTA one. So any move towards greater truth in advertising in feasibility studies is, of course, to be strongly endorsed, and that role should go to the PC. There's just no question about it. The one area, I think the area that I want to talk about is really a recommendation that I do take issue with, because I think it's misinformed. I disagree with the recommendation about the idea that an agreement should be subject to detailed analysis done by an independent authority after the initialing and before parliamentary ratification through the implementing legislation. And the reason I disagree with that is for a number of reasons, and this is where I'm finishing, Peter, so if you'll just give me a minute. First of all, if we already agree that most of, a lot of what drives Australia's PTAs are not commercial considerations in the first place, you're not going to find much in the economic modelling anyways. So why bother doing it? It will be self-undermining for the government that might want a PTA for a non-commercial objective. So that's a risk. The second thing is the economic modelling only there's lots of things that can't be shown, even in the dynamic models. And so I'm not a modeler, obviously, but areas such as competition policy, those kinds of outcomes can't be modeled. So, there's lots of a PTA that can't be modeled, no matter how good your modeling and your assumptions are. So there's nothing that takes the place of a qualitative analysis of a trade agreement. The idea that you have more stakeholder consultations, I think, is also problematic after an agreement has been signed. What will they yield? Aren't you really saying to your negotiating partner, we're going to unpick the agreement if our key constituents come back and don't like it? So I think it's like trying to negotiate, it would be like the US trying to negotiate without trade promotion authority. It would be hard for our partners to come to the table knowing that there's a chance for our constituents to have another bite at the cherry and to say, whoa, you know. So I think that is also very problematic. Parliament is the obvious place for the final assessment to take place. Australia is, in many respects, way ahead of many parliamentary democracies in having a joint standing committee on treaties where this can occur, in having national interest analyses that have to be tabled, whether, you know, whether the quality of them is good enough or not is a sort of parliamentary reform our independents might like to be talking about. So, although we'll get banned the bananas, so maybe we don't want to go there either. So, we have a Senate that has done this. The Senate did this very effectively prior to the negotiation of the Australia-US FTA, when Labor, which had the numbers in the Senate, signalled very clearly through its report voting on trade that it would not support an investor-state dispute settlement mechanism in the Australia-US FTA. That was well before the negotiation was finished, and that was a very valuable exercise for the government of the day. So I think our current processes are the envy of countries like Canada that don't have anything like this. We could do it differently. When Colombia had its negotiation with the US, it had town hall meetings where ministers and its equivalent of DFAT officials had to present to thousands of Colombians who wanted answers to their questions. They tabled drafts of the negotiating text in sort of public repositories where people could come through, you know, in a different way than the internet. So all I'm saying is our mechanisms are there. They're pretty good, and I think that where the PC could usefully direct its comments in that chapter would be towards thinking about tweaking our existing mechanisms. So.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Anne. And finally, not least, the doyen of FTA analysts and econometricians, Philippa D.
Like Anne just said, I'm at the end because I'm shortest. You kind of had the glass half full from Anne. You're kind of going to get the glass half empty from me. And I'm probably going to repeat some of the stuff that Kristen said, but that's probably not surprising. I want to talk about, I mean, Anne's talked about these things not really being signed for economic reasons, but the terms, one of your terms of reference, you know, plays it with a straight bat and says, look at the economics of it. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at your terms of reference that says, the particular point that says, you know, are regional trade agreements suited to tackling barriers to trade and investment? And I take Tricia's point that these agreements are not about pushing unilateral liberalisation, because we can do that anyway. So the real issue is not whether they force us to liberalise at home, but are they successful in beating down barriers elsewhere? That's what I want to talk about. In my view, though, the report kind of takes every, you know, the main chapters out of existing trade agreements and says, do they do that job well? And it comes up with some recommendations for how to do those jobs better. What I think it doesn't do enough of is stand back and look at the total universe of barriers, trade barriers that are out there. Also look at the barriers that these regional trade agreements are not doing much, if anything, about. And I think in that broader context, you might see that, you know, fine-tuning some of the processes for regional trade agreements might be sort of an in-border issue by comparison. So what do these trade agreements not do a particularly good job at? One of the things that Christopher talked about was trade facilitation. We know that these agreements can do something towards that, because to the extent that, you know, long dwell times in customs are to do with whether you've got to go through a red lane or not. If these agreements can increase the proportion of goods that can go through a green lane, they'll probably do a lot there, but there's other stuff involved in customs clearance and so forth that's not typically dealt with. The whole issue of, you know, we have paper systems and we have discretionary bureaucrats making these decisions because it's a great form of graft in some of our neighbouring countries. I mean, these countries need some assistance to get, you know, their customs clearance processes done in an electronic format where you take the bureaucrats out, you take the discretionary decision making out. I don't see a lot of that work being done in trade agreements. Let's also talk about non-tariff barriers. In the last week or so, I've been involved in some work in a G20 context, and I hasten to add that this is not talking about G20 as a potential trade agreement. It's actually looking instead at the equation of trade equals jobs in the current climate coming out of the global financial crisis. So that's the context. I hasten to say that these numbers are very provisional and certainly premature to announce them outside of this room, so please don't quote me on this. They're so provisional, but I'm rerunning my part of it as we speak. But the orders of magnitude, I think, are interesting. Tariff reductions among G20 on an MFN basis are about 60 billion gains in welfare gains per year globally. 60. Non-tariff barriers, the number's 200. So we're talking about gains from getting a handle on non-tariff barriers 3 times the gains from tariffs. Partly because they're bigger, and partly because when you put them on top of the tariffs that remain, the effects are compounding. Okay? So where does services and investment fit in? Well, the numbers that I've generated for that come out at 25 billion annually. A lot less even than tariffs, but there's a reason for that. The reason for that is that people asked me to do the job at this particularly European hang-up on national treatment when it comes to services and investment, and they, frankly, I think, missed half the action. That's what I want to talk about now, because this is where I do most of my work. In services and investment, mostly what trade agreements do, and regional agreements are not the only sole culprits here. I think the WTO suffers from the same problem. They've got to hang up on national treatment. They've got to hang up on removing discrimination against foreigners. What they fail to pay enough attention to is all the barriers that are there to services and investment that are affecting foreign players and domestic new entrants equally. Why do we have this hang up on national treatment? I think there's a number of reasons. I'll give you 2 of them. One is it's what trade negotiators are used to from thinking about goods. Another reason is I think there's an awful lot of people out there who make false extrapolations from the experience of the EU to the rest of the world. Now the EU, certainly as it was first conceived prior to expansion, was a rich countries club. All fairly well-developed economies, fairly complex structures, and in that context, and lots of two-way trade, because basically you're in a situation where the gains from trade are essentially coming from greater gradations of variety. It's not so much comparative advantage, it's gains from greater variety and specialisation. In that context, the Europeans are quite right to say that the only thing you need to do with services and investment is remove discrimination against foreigners and harmonise. Because the basic underlying thought there is that basically the regulatory structures that they've got are basically okay, it would just be better if they were all the same. Okay? But we know outside of Europe that the levels of these barriers also matter. In Indonesia, anybody can get new entry into the telecommunications industry, so long as, it seems, so long as their name is Bakri. In Malaysia, as of about a year ago, they had not issued a single new banking licence since the 1970s. Now they've just announced some big new reforms there. I don't know if they've issued new licences yet. But even in Europe, it's a furphy to say that levels don't matter. All you have to do is look at the regulations on entry into the professions in Austria. So levels do matter. And the problem isn't necessarily just discrimination against foreigners. The problem is often a general lack of contestability. It affects not just foreign entrants but domestic new entrants. And in that context, if you sign a regional trade agreement that removes discrimination against a particular foreign supplier, What you're offering is the opportunity for those foreign suppliers to join the domestic cartel, rip out some nice fat monopoly rents and send them back home. And that's doing negative, that's doing damage to the host country. It's not beneficial for the host country, it's doing positive damage. So why do we observe that not much is actually happening in services and investment? Why is everybody finding that all the offers on the table are nothing other than standstill? There's a couple of reasons for that. And one of them is, importantly, countries are obviously very loath to make commitments on national treatment when they haven't got their own act together on their general regulations that would guarantee contestability. You know, the ASEANs are quite acutely aware of the danger, given their current regulatory structures, of the danger of opening up to foreigners and having those foreigners rip out the rents and take them overseas. I mean, Australia is guilty of the same thing. I've heard Australian trade officials say quite explicitly, we have no intention of offering anything in a services agreement that we weren't planning to do anyway. Right? So let's forget about these things, at least in the services front, as being a vehicle for pushing reform at home, because they're not. What we can think of them as being is a blunt instrument to engineer a bit of access for some of our services suppliers into regional markets so that those suppliers can rip out some of the monopoly rents in those markets and bring them back home. Now that might be really good for Australia. It might give us some nice big fat income gains to those exporters, but in my view it's not a very neighbourly thing to do. So what is a neighbourly thing to do? I think a neighbourly thing to do is to help these countries get their domestic regulatory structures together. And this, I think, is where the report can sharpen up its views on the role of transparency and the nature of transparency and how it should work. Okay, if we're talking about beating down foreign barriers, we're talking about the kind of transparency that will help our neighbours understand their own regulatory structures a bit better, to understand a process by which they can make them better. Now, none of these countries are going to instantly jump to sort of OECD best practice. So there's heaps of scope here within that transparency process for experience sharing. It's not just us going over and lecturing them about what's wrong with their economy. It's about them helping them to get together to talk about experiences of what it's been like to try and improve things. Now, what does that sort of peer review process remind you of? Well, we've got a couple of forums for that. One is the Trade Policy Review Mechanism in the WTO, and the other one is the APEC Talk Fest. For all that it might have been a talk fest, it's actually been very successful over the decades in providing a forum for exactly that kind of experience sharing amongst economies that are at vastly different levels of development. What do trade agreements do? They make the classic mistake of competition policy. They don't protect competition, they protect particular competitors. I think what we need to do is start to look at mechanisms that will help us promote contestability more generally in our trade partner countries. And we might not be quite as well off economically if we do that, because it means rather than being in a position to rip out monopoly rents, we might actually find ourselves starting to face a bit of more fierce competition from some of the domestic players in those economies. But in my view, that is, in the long term, an approach and a strategy that is much more consistent with our foreign policy objectives as well as our economic objectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. About 20 minutes or so for questions, so the panel's now open to question, and I should make it clear again that welcome questions from our Productivity Commission colleagues who are here, the principals and others who are here, as well as from the audience more generally. And then I'll provide an opportunity for Patricia and perhaps Gary to say a few words at the end. Okay, who's on? We'll go to some new ones. Up the back first.
Thank you.
Could you take the mic?
Hi, I'm Emma Aisbert from the Crawford School, and I'd like to make a couple of comments regarding Philippa's presentation, which I firstly would like to applaud. Firstly, some supporting evidence. I have a paper using the World Bank's World Business Environment Survey, looking at regulatory constraint faced by all sorts of firms around the world in countries from all around the world, and it shows very clearly that foreign firms do not face more regulatory constraint than domestic firms. So, totally agree with you there, except perhaps in OECD countries. Another point related to that, and your sort of rent-seeking by the foreign firms argument, is the relationship between these structures and international investment agreements, which are, well, investment chapters in PTAs. Insofar as these agreements tend to have a regulatory takings aspect, there's a real danger that you lock in these rents for the foreign firms, because the government is then scared to change policy in a way that takes away their rents, because they will get sued by the foreign firms. Thank you.
Want to come back on that, Phil?
No, I absolutely agree. Nullify and impair. That's exactly right.
No, yeah. You've got a mic.
Good, thanks very much, Malcolm from the ANU Enterprise again. Look, there's a few pages in here where, in the report, which talks about the bilateral arrangements in terms of our aid program, in terms of being able to provide technical assistance to countries, and the particular agreement that's referred to as PACER, and it seems to get applauded. And they've got a box there that comes from AusAid. Well, I must admit, I find the PACER sort of arrangements and the technical assistance that we're providing to these countries to give them negotiating expertise and skills to negotiate with Australian negotiators have been very flawed assistance provided by Australia to these countries, and in my view it takes the worst aspects of the European model in terms of how they've gone about negotiating their agreements, EPAs, etc. They basically bring along a pile of money, and this is now being wrapped up in aid for trade, so it's aid for trade on a bilateral basis, when in fact if there's going to be aid for trade, it seems to me it should be on a multilateral basis. Here we are trying to provide capacity, telling these countries, the PACER countries, that in fact they should enter FTAs with Australia, when in fact we're now finding that FTAs aren't providing much benefit to us anyway. So I guess my question to the panel would be, does this really make sense, and is this really a wise use of Australian bilateral aid? Thank you.
I think both Christopher and Philippa had things to say about that in another dimension. So, Christopher, would you like to say?
Well, I'll probably reiterate my colleague's point that the capacity building that's relevant, it seems to me, is the pro-competition capacity building. So what we want to do is build a regime that facilitates entry into the markets of these countries. I suppose the response is that, well, the Australians are coming at them, and like you said earlier, it's not a greenfield site, and people are going to be coming at our trading partners looking for preferential agreements. So, having the sort of conversation that we've had today does seem like a good idea. What are you trying to get out of these agreements? How would you design it? How would you respond to that approach? What characteristics would you look for in the agreement? Be clear about what you're trying to achieve, understand what the risks are. So if that was the portfolio, I would be comfortable with it. But I agree with you, it's about proliferating an agreement of a structure which isn't achieving those things, and that seems like a waste of time.
It seems to be a little bit like a clear
that's another
country, and
anything to add, Philippa?
No.
Up the back.
Thanks. Hazel Moyer. I have a question for Philippa. In recommendation 4 of the draft report, it says the government should take a cautious approach and I quote, to negotiating and including IP protections in agreements. Now, when you call a spade, what the Commission calls an IP protection is in fact a legislative monopoly. Given your comments on pro-competition, would you like to comment on that draft recommendation?
Thanks, Philippa.
You know, it's a well-recognised fact, I think, generally, that the TRIPS agreement was counterproductive and damaging to developing economies, but was signed into the Uruguay round because of the single undertaking. Unfortunately, that has set a precedent for regional trade agreements. And what we're observing, particularly in agreements that are made with major IP exporting countries, is we're seeing a proliferation and extension of that damage through regional trade agreements. I cannot believe the provisions that were signed onto in our agreement with the United States. You know, it's not by accident that when the Americans themselves extended, copyright protection from the life of the author plus 50 years to the life of the author plus 70 years, they called it the Mickey Mouse Amendment. Because Walt Disney has been dead for 50 years, right? This is precisely the kind of monopoly, as Hazel was pointing out, the kind of monopoly positions that are being written into regional trade agreements. I think the Commission's recommendation that talks very coyly about examining the provisions in trade agreements and making sure essentially that they're consistent with domestic policy objectives is a bit like, shutting the door after the horse has bolted, because that's precisely what didn't happen with the Australia-US agreement. We signed on to provisions that preempted or cut completely against the grain of, studies and recommendations that were being done domestically.
Andrew, I think it's next to you.
Thanks. Andrew Willick again from ANU. And I'd just like to make some comments which draw together some of the things that came up in the panel. I think it's very important that, as Ross said, it's a big report, it contains many things, but does remind a bit of elephants in committees. A lot of discussion about whether some elephant's tail could be made curly or the tusk sharper. I'm not going to talk about the elephant. And the Productive Commission has taken an economy-wide view. That's its traditional strength, but we need to do more in this report. We need more than a short-term economy-wide view of whether particular FTAs are good or bad, or can the rules maybe make it a bit better. We need to take a wider view of the long-term implications of a preferential trading system. Ross introduced the historical element into this. I wish he'd added one more to it. What would have happened, the counterfactual, if after the Second World War, we had stayed with the preferential trading blocks, the trade arrangements approach to international trade. East Asia couldn't have traded its way out of the problems. We would not be here today.
Question?
Yeah, it's just a comment. I'm sorry, but I think the question for the Commission really is that it's just not good enough to say whatever Australia does, FTAs are here to stay, and we may as well just tinker at the edges and make them a little bit less dirty than the other way might be. We need Australia to take a leadership role in looking at an opportunity for the world, perhaps through the G20, look beyond the Doha round. How do you avoid a generation riddled with FTAs and preferentialism? How do we get back to a system which can create global prosperity? You can't just duck the issue and say Australia doesn't matter. Okay, thank you.
Can I
just
you're going to play?
Quick one? Quick response?
Yeah. I just think, Andrew, it's naive. I mean, I agree with you in my heart of hearts, and it's good to be idealistic, but they are here to stay. There's hundreds more being negotiated, and we have taken a leadership role consistently in the WTO, going back to 1958 when Australia wanted to challenge the EC under the provisions of Article 24 at the time, and it was refused because because of Cold War considerations. So that horse bolted at the WTO, a long time ago. Australia pushed really hard for the transparency mechanism. We don't have a hell of a lot of supporters in continuing to push for that to be made more than provisional right now. So, I mean, and so I think, when we signed the Australia-US FTA, there was kind of dismay in the WTO because they thought, you know, Australia, New Zealand, these are the countries that care deeply about multilateralism, all right? But that one has bolted as well. So I think that you're left with looking at how do you make PTAs that actually contribute to non-discrimination and to mitigating the most pernicious effects, which incidentally aren't that pernicious, thank Christ, in our region compared to other regions in the world because of supply chains and because of regionalization happening from the bottom up. But I think to take a purist approach is not helpful either for our trade negotiators, our people in Geneva, or our government in trying to think of where to go next to deal with the mess that the world has created.
We've got lots of questions. Andrew, we've got lots of questions. We'll come back to these points and try to wrap up some of the implications of them at the end. So that we can draw them out. But we've got limited time now, so if everybody can find their last questions, a short, sharp question, and the panel responses likewise. Up to that question.
Hello, my name is Aaron Sahan. I've got a really quick question, and I ask it because capacity building was identified as a legitimate rationale for entering into trade agreements, and also I want to build on Malcolm's point earlier. Firstly, the first question is capacity building potentially a negotiation chip in trade agreement negotiations? And if so, do you believe this could compromise the effectiveness of capacity building? Thank you.
Anyone want to respond to that immediately or take it on board? Next question.
Brett Williams from the University of Sydney Law School. I think it is important to come back to that big picture issue about the proliferation of trade agreements. The first slide that you saw today showed the exponential growth and the huge shift away from a non-discriminatory trading system to a discriminatory one. People have noted today that there are two effects, that when you get into that situation you actually make multilateral liberalisation less likely and you make more preferential liberalisation even more likely, so it's a kind of a spiral that you can't get out of. And I think you do have to think about what sort of a world you want to live in. There is a shift going on here. Do you want to live in a world that's completely dominated by power relationships or legal relationships? You do get to the stage where little countries like Australia will have to negotiate one-on-one with big countries on big issues. So if you want to negotiate one-on-one with India on movement of natural persons, and one-on-one with China on FDI, and one-on-one with the United States on how long the copyright term should be, then fragmenting into lots and lots of discriminatory agreements is a good way to do that. So I think in this report what I see as a bit disappointing is you need an overall strategy about turning around that situation. I think Australia should have a strategy for changing WTO rules and a strategy for what sort of regional agreement is likely to be compatible with changing WTO rules. Two practical suggestions. The committee report refers to improving WTO disciplines, but it doesn't refer to the WTO rules that limit you increasing the barriers to outsiders, and that's a key issue. Second, the report refers to the RIRDC features of a good trade agreement and refers to phasing out preferences, but that's not included in the recommendations at all, and I think that's an important possible way forward.
I think the first part of your comment comes to the hard edge of the conversation, cross-conversation, past conversation was between Andrew and Anne here, but next one up to that.
Thanks, Peter. My name is John McDonald. I'd just like to give a quick view from the private sector. Basically, these days, the private sector is not so much interested in supply chains, transaction chains. What motivates them in looking at these sorts of agreements is what risk is entailed in the transactions and how can they see the risk, assess the risk and manage the risk. And if they can do that, they'll go with any agreement that lets them make those assessments, whether it be multilateral, preferential, or anything else. Thanks.
Any comment, Chris, on that one?
Well,
come on, take some more and we'll come back.
Go ahead.
Now, I'd say the same point applies within those supply chains. That is exactly what people are looking for. I mean, my understanding is that the fragmentation process is happening in manufacturing and in services. I mean, what we hear about the engineers is that they'll put teams together from around the region in order to get a contract, or the architects as well. What they want is a regime that helps them managing the risk of constructing those supply chains. So if you want to look at it in those terms, that's fine, but I think it's the same.
There's a step back, you've got to go to the bank first.
Yeah, that's right. And you need the surety that you've got access to the market at the other end. What regime is going to give you that?
What the transaction costs?
Thanks. I actually have a lot of things that I'd like to talk about, but sorry if I get into my commission. But speaking mainly because of my role in the answer and the Malaysia one, maybe 3 quick comments and a question. The first one is to support you, Anne, on that point about, if you were to stuff around doing, after initially going into some public consultation process, forget that. The point of countries like ours, like Australia and New Zealand, is credibility. When you do a deal, and you know that a deal sticks when you negotiate with Australia or New Zealand. And it's not going to be unpicked for you. You are not the United States, neither are we. And it's a firm foundation of the way in which we operate and take policy terms. The second point was around its capacity building and interesting series of questions. I think one of the things that productivity could usefully, the Commission might usefully want to look at is in a bit more detail at the answer. I mean, the answer is a real attempt by us, and it's by no means perfect, but it's a real attempt by us to try to pick up that capacity building, to deal with the regulatory points, the things around customs, facilitation and so on, to conduct training seminars, workshops, build that capacity over the next 5 years, 3 to 5 years.
So money would stop renovating young people.
Yeah, that's another problem altogether. That brings me to my third thing, which is now my question. Non-tariff barriers. I couldn't agree more. That is obviously the big game for these. I'll tell you what the problem is for us as negotiators. Going around to business trying to find out what is the non-tariff barrier that bothers you. I'll tell you what, the big companies, they know what it is, but some of them don't want to tell us because they don't know how to negotiate past it. So I found, in my experience,
I rest my case.
So there's plenty of criticism, you failed to get deal with those non-tariff barriers. I go around to these businesses afterwards and say, well, what were they? You never told me a single one. So I just guessed around it. Now, these FTAs do actually deal with non-tariff barriers. Now, in the Malaysian New Zealand FTA, and I'm not trying to show off here, but just as an example, very fine agreement. Just came into force. That has 48-hour customs clearance as a legally binding commitment that Malaysia has made to New Zealand. That is a major thing, and I would argue that once Malaysia is doing it for New Zealand, why the hell wouldn't you do it for everyone else? So there's covered the European thing. But my question is, how can we, as negotiators, do better? If business aren't telling us, what is it that we're going to do? Now, I know I am a modeller. I used to work at the OC.
Quickly, the question. Anyone want to respond to that? We'll hold it. Maybe we'll hold any further responses from the panel. Just take the last few questions that we can. Thanks.
I'm Dominic Marr from Crawford School. My question's for Anne. You put a list of non-economic motivations for these FTAs up on the screen. The question is, do you think that these kind of agreements are the best strategy for achieving those objectives? Or is there something else that we should be doing if that's what we're really trying to achieve?
The Productivity Commission report actually addresses that, and it suggests alternative ways for dealing, for instance, with security issues. But I think one of the problems is that these are a well-known brand now. FTAs are like, you want to have an FTA like you want to have an iPod. Like, they're a currency now, and so you can, and they're well known. They're a global currency, and so it's easier to achieve. That when they talk about the head-turning effects, for instance. So I think that it takes more effort to think about how to pursue these objectives through instruments other than PTAs. And yes, the instruments are available, but PTAs are a very convenient vehicle now for doing it.
I want to give the other panel members an opportunity to make one final point if they wish. So, Andrew?
Well, just on that issue, I think Aaron's right. It's quite complex. Obviously, the US FTA, for example, these relationship between Howard and Bush, the security relationship between Australia and the US was fundamental to starting that. Now, how did we get the business access to the visas? It didn't happen in the FTA, but if the FTA hadn't occurred, it wouldn't have happened. Similarly, we've managed to get very good access now to the US defence procurement market. That wasn't part of the FTA either. Could we have got it just on the basis of the relationship that Howard and Bush had in the security relationship? I don't think so. In fact, there are lots of things that were written in the US FTA which were used by our negotiators to win access to the US defence market. So, it's easy to say that, we ought to keep all these things pure, but it doesn't work like that. There's little bits and pieces of intermingled policy in all these things. And if we've got clever people in the departments, they'll be able to use a little link here and a link there. That's what middle powers do, to try and get the sort of things that they want. So I think the idea of having pure FTAs or keeping out other policy considerations, that's not going to happen. It's not the way it works, and that's not even the way we would want it to work.
Christopher?
Really nice question about getting information from people who don't have the incentive to reveal it, and for the purpose of doing modelling or identifying priorities. I think we're getting better at collecting indicators of performance at the market level, and then comparing and linking that to the policy environment that's around those markets. And as we get better and better at that, just as they got better and better at measuring agricultural protection, we'll get better and better at measuring some of the other non-tariff barriers and services policies, and we'll be able to make sharper comments about that. That's one way to go forward.
And Philippa?
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on an issue that Brett Williams sort of talked about or hinted at or whatever, and that's this question of sitting down and with a clean sheet of paper and saying, well, what sensibly should be negotiated on a bilateral basis? What's appropriate for a bilateral negotiation? And instead of this accepting the current template of regional trade agreements that's given. There are a few things that people talk about, like mutual recognition of professions and so forth. There are some certain issues that are, some people seem to think are sort of natural bilateral issues and therefore belong naturally in a regional trade agreement. I just caution about thoughtlessly accepting some of those assertions. Where, again, in a European context, when you're talking about trade amongst equals, trade will be two-way trade, and it does make sense for that recognition to be mutual. If you're talking about North-South agreements, typically one will be the exporter and one will be the importer, and if you want trade in professions, you only need one side to grant the recognition. You've got countries like Singapore that are major importers of skills, of health professionals, for example. But the Singaporean health professional organisations themselves have quite happily, over the last few decades, developed their own list of training institutions from which they will accept professionals, and they did that on their own account with no help from government and no trade agreements required at all. So let's not kid ourselves about just how two-way some of these negotiations are going to be with some of our trading partners. And if they're not going to be two-way, then maybe we need to take them out of a trade agreement negotiation forum altogether and have a much quieter conversation that doesn't set up all these expectations in advance just by the announcement of a negotiation, where then things get momentum from day one and nobody can back off.
Thanks very much, Philippa. I know there are a lot more questions out there. We could go on all night, but we have to wrap it up. And I'm standing between you and your drink, which is a bad thing. Let me just say a few things about what I hear is the sense of the discussion today, and then I'll have Patricia and Gary say whether I got right or wrong. But as I hear the discussion today, I think we've heard a lot of support for the thrust of the argument in the draft report. There have been a lot of questions of detail about the particular arguments and how they're developed. But I think my sense is that the meeting has delivered a feeling that perspective is a bit lost on the report, and if you, it's sort of like the recommendations as a whole are less than the sum of the parts, really, and I sort of wonder why that is so. It comes back to some of the commentary that was made about almost a defensive attitude towards thinking about the role of PTAs and how they can be used, rather than a strategic attitude towards them. And the strategic attitude towards them might involve an upfront recommendation which states fairly clearly what underlying objectives are for Australian trade policy and the turning of these instruments to those objectives as an important objective of trade policy. To put it less abstractly, it might sort of emphasise the importance of Australian trade policy and the connections between Australian trade policy and domestic policy to the promotion of openness or contestability of the Australian economy and the global economy, because Australia's place in the global economy is one not to dominate outcomes in that economy. And so that's not there, so the whole organisation of recommendations is sort of step by step going back and digging back into the report, but the report says much more than the actual final recommendations appear to say. So I get that sense of the discussion. I may be pushing it a little bit too far, but I think that sense is in the conversation we've had. And I should emphasise that when you look at the terms of reference for this inquiry, they are very broad. They do allow the Commission to say this, to deal with these strategic issues, these broader issues, to set it in the context here. They ask for the Commission to look into bilateral trade arrangements of all kinds, not just particular kinds of bilateral trade arrangements, and to focus in that on the facilitation of domestic reform, the link between domestic reform, and to make comparisons between global and multilateral strategies and bilateral strategies. So there's an opportunity to do that within the mandate that the Commission's been given for this and within the report, and it doesn't take much tweaking, but I think it would be really quite important tweaking to try to bring that perspective to bear, which is implicit in the argument of the report, out more full frontal in the final draft report. I think that would include the consideration of some of the issues that people mentioned in respect of strategies towards regime, that is multilateral regime maintenance, including the scope for critical mass agreements. It's all there in the report, they're all there in the report, but it could be related to that sort of strategic statement about how we can direct these instruments to that fundamental objective that we have for Australian, I say commercial policy, not just trade policy, because as has been made, the point has been made time and time again in the conversation this afternoon. You know, we're not talking about the 1950s here where international exchange was predominantly commodity exchange. We're talking about the 21st century in which international exchange is a complex mix, link of commodity exchange, services, investment and all the rest of it, and the unpackaging of those things only in the negotiation of agreements only does damage to your interests. Doing that is rather important. And that leads me to the last sort of general sense that I take away from the meeting, which is that the link between the domestic reform agenda and the international commercial policy strategy is not drawn out in the way that quite you'd expect it to be drawn out, given the argument of the draft report itself, and given the primary role, as it were, of the Productivity Commission and the terms of reference that was presented here. And I think in the recommendations or the summary or whatever, it would be helpful to draw that out, that link out much more explicitly, and that would give a stronger sense of coherence to the argument of the report than there appears to be at the moment. But they're, very general, but I hope helpful summary. That's a very general, but I hope helpful summary of what I take to be some of the elements in the conversation we've had this afternoon, which has been very lively, very active, and I'm very thankful to you all for that. But let me ask Patricia first of all if you'd like to make just one or two words of response, and then perhaps Gary might like to.
We won't say much.
Well, Peter, thank you very much, and thanks for the very strong feedback. That's good to have. Look, I think I'll go away, and I'm sure the team and Andy will go away and think particularly about our capacity to get messages across. We actually thought we had quite a strong report about PDAs and saying, look, there are alternatives, would you please look at them? But I get a sense that that message is not coming through loudly and clearly. So there's got to be a better way. Many of the comments I think warrant a very good consideration. And I'm really not on your wavelength on some aspects. I guess we know these things are sold to the Australian community on the basis that they're trade agreements and they're economic gain. We've been given the gig, not the strategic centre for foreign affairs and diplomatic accords. It's the economic arguments that we've been asked to assess. And so I guess, I think in all truthfulness, if they want to do things for defence reasons, then let them do a defence agreement. If they want to do things for diplomatic reasons, or then have a cocktail party. Don't dress it up as a trade agreement. So, thank you.
Gary, would you like to?
Look, there's lots we could respond to, but I guess ultimately our response will come in the team's final report that Andy and Patricia are overseeing. I found this incredibly stimulating and interesting. My old love is trade policy, and I worked for the GATT Secretariat many years ago before people realised it existed and started chucking bricks through the window after the Seattle thing. So I love all this stuff, and it is incredibly complex. I mean, I would say that once you're in this territory, there's a lot more grey, a lot more different shades of grey than in the good old territory that I also worked in. This will show how old I am, even in the latter stage of the tariff board, when we were looking at the tariff on wingnuts. So I think the complexities are greater. I'd like to think our analysis has risen to the challenge. People who have criticisms or suggestions should make those. Hopefully in specific terms. There's been a little bit of Churchillian rhetoric today, which is lovely, and so on, but some specifics would help as well. We will certainly follow up, the team will, and we saw this as a pivotal forum for feedback to for us to get an understanding where we can do some more in-depth discussions with people, and some of you in this room may well get called upon for smaller forums, but I leave that to the judgment of Patricia and the team. So probably finally just remains to thank Peter and the Crawford School, and indeed the National Institute for Public Policy, and indeed this Coombs Policy Forum, because it's just been a fantastic environment for us to get this kind of feedback from a quality audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you. There's an announcement. The drinks are now served.